Akiva was trying to change the complexion of the inherited law. To accomplish this, he had to find an authority superior to that of his predecessors and accepted by everyone. Only one instrument could fulfill those requirements: Scripture itself. Finkelstein, Akiva, Scholar, Saint, and Martyr, page 171.
Hi, everybody. Welcome to the Apocrypha Apocalypse. I'm Gary Machida. We're continuing our series on a very important topic about the birth of the rabbinic Bible, i.e. the birth of the rabbinic canon, specifically focused on Rabbi Akiva ben Joseph. And we've done a number of episodes up till this point, and I hope you forgive me for doing that because there is a lot of information from a lot of different areas that need to be laid out in order to see the big picture. So we're doing short videos, but the videos are packed with lots of information. So instead of recapping everything we've done so far, I highly recommend that you go back to episode 1 if you haven't seen it and go through the series, because God willing, I'm laying this out in an orderly sequence so that you can get that big picture. So in the last episode, we talked about Akiva after reorganizing Jewish tradition in order to meet the needs of the destruction of the temple and redefining Judaism along non-cultic lines, making it essentially a religion of the book. He needed to nail down his teachings in something that would be seen as authoritative above even the oral traditions. And as the quote just made by Finkelstein, he needed to ground this in Scripture. And we talked about how he uses a special line of argumentation called inclusion and limitation, where he looked at minute details in the actual text of the Hebrew text, tiny little dots and so on, and read huge vistas of meaning into all these eccentricities of the Hebrew text in order to fill out the needed instructions and to give the impression that it's all based on Scripture. And the fallout from that is that in order to complete this, and I think this is the biggest takeaway from the last episode, is to pull it off, to actually have authority and be able to make that change within Judaism from covenantal continuity when the temple was up and running. You had the priesthood sacrifices as prescribed by the law of Moses, to a religion of the book. To make that sharp turn, you have to rest on some sort of divine authority. You have to ground all these new regulations and teachings in Scripture. And so Scripture becomes paramount. And up until this time, as we've talked about in previous videos, in the first century, you had many different texts in circulation. And it's really at this time that Akiva establishes a standardized Hebrew text. And we can see where his interpretation, his method points to that fact, because after all, if you have other Hebrew text tradition in circulation, somebody could say, Akiva, you're wrong, because what you say about this extra letter in this manuscript is not true for this particular Hebrew rendition. So there can only be one authoritative text that would be seen as the text for rabbinic Judaism. That is what eventually becomes the Masoretic text. And this is in the second Christian century. It's a post-Christian canon. Well, in this episode, we're going to look at further evidence that that is exactly what occurred, that Akiva was lining up certain standardized texts so they become kind of the official text in order to make his teachings and decrees linked to Scripture in various ways. So fasten your seatbelts, folks, because the Apocrypha Apocalypse begins right now. As we've seen in this series, there were a multitude of different text types in circulation within Judea in the first Christian century. And so we know that there were various Hebrew text traditions, including the Proto-Masoretic text tradition. This is kind of the predecessor of what later becomes the official rabbinic Bible, but there were other Hebrew text types out there as well. There were Greek translations out as well, the most popular being the Septuagint. We'll talk more about the Septuagint in a little bit, but also other ones as well. At least we know there was a Proto-Theodosian version, which is essentially a Greek translation that's brought a little bit closer in line with the MT text type. And there were also Aramaic scriptures out there. These are known as Targum. And a Targum is basically a paraphrase, an Aramaic paraphrase of scripture. So for the three major languages that were spoken in Judea, there were different text types, different translations available. So if you knew Hebrew, you could read scripture or hear scripture in Hebrew and a number of different text types. If you're Greek, you could hear it in a number of different text types or translations, I should say. And if you only knew Aramaic, you could learn it through the Targums and their rendition of the scripture. So there are many different forms in circulation in the first century. This, by the way, is something that was really brought to light with the discovery of the Dead Sea Scrolls. So it's a fairly recent discovery. So we looked at how Akiva needed to reinterpret and have rulings that had the appearances of being based on scripture. And he did it through his inclusion and limitation interpretation scheme. And so it looked like he was being hyper literal with the Hebrew text when actually he was just reading things into the text. Now, the important thing is it needed to show or at least manifest some way that it's tied to divine revelation in order for it to have authority. But if there's many different text types out there, if there are different Hebrew scripts that maybe don't have those same eccentricities as the Proto-MT did, again, that Hebrew text that's later accepted by the rabbis, maybe there were other ones that differed, that didn't have an extra letter or an extra dash or something like that. Someone could say, Akiva, you're wrong because the Hebrew text says this. So there had to be a standardized text for rabbinic Judaism. This was a necessity in order to reconfigure Judaism as a religion of the book. You have to establish what is the book. And that's insinuated simply by his interpretive method. But we have other evidence that also suggests that that same kind of standardization of the text occurs elsewhere as well. And one thing we haven't talked about is the Septuagint, at least not in great detail, because like I said, in addition to those who could read or understand Hebrew, there were a lot of Greek-speaking Jews in Judea, not only in the first century, but second century as well, and certainly beyond Judea in the diaspora, the Jewish diaspora that spread into Italy and elsewhere. And these Jews read Greek and they needed a translation. And the most popular translation at the time is a pre-Christian Jewish translation known as the Septuagint or the 70. So sometimes you'll see the Septuagint indicated with the LXX, and with the Hebrew text, you'll sometimes have NT, that's for the Masoretic text. Now, it's apparent that the Septuagint, its popularity was not only outside of Judea, but even within Judea. Scholars believe that there was a large population of Greek-speaking Jews in Jerusalem, and it was quite likely that in these synagogues, they read the scriptures via the Septuagint, interesting enough. So something needed to be done, because if Akiva's authority is to be established not only amongst the Jews that could just read Hebrew, but all of Judaism, and again, this is Judaism in the second Christian century. This is after all the different Judaisms of the first have largely disappeared. leaving only Christianity and the Pharisees surviving the catastrophic first revolt, something needs to be done with the Septuagint. Not only was it popular amongst the Jews, but it was also popular amongst that other surviving group known as the Christians. And we know from the New Testament that the Septuagint is the preferred text of the inspired authors of the New Testament. It's quoted, I think, somewhere around 80% of the time. All the Old Testament quotations in the New Testament come from the Septuagint. Now, it's the preferred text. It's not the exclusive text. And this has been noted for hundreds of years, that the Septuagint, the New Testament doesn't restrict itself only to the Septuagint. Occasionally, it will use the Proto-MT. Occasionally, it will use other text types as well, because, again, it's a first century document, and first century Judaism, first century AD, by the way, had a variety of text in circulation. So it's not a surprise that other texts were quoted, but the preferred text in the New Testament is the Septuagint. And of course, Christianity coming out of the gate used the Septuagint for its evangelism. So this makes the Septuagint a primary target for Akiva, because if he's going to kind of redefine Judaism along non-cultic lines and turn it into rabbinic Judaism, you need to do something with the Septuagint. And he does do something with the Septuagint. He replaces it. And this is done through a disciple of his known as Aquila and the Aquila translation. So who was Aquila?
He was by birth a Gentile from Pontus, and is said by Epiphanius to have been a connection by marriage of the Emperor Hadrian, and to have been appointed by him, about the year 128, to an office concerned with the rebuilding of Jerusalem as Aelia Capitolina. At some unknown age he joined the Christians, but afterward left them and became a proselyte to Judaism. According to Jerome, he was a disciple of Rabbi Akiva. The Talmud states that he finished his translations under the influence of Rabbi Akiva, and that his other teachers were Eleazar ben Hyrcanus and Joshua ben Hananiah. It is certain, however, that Aquila's translation had appeared before the publication of Irenaeus Adversus Heresies, i.e., before 177. Isidore Singer, The Jewish Encyclopedia.
So you have this Gentile who's a pagan, he becomes Christian, he apostatizes from Christianity, becomes Jewish, and he sits under the teachings of Akiva. And it is this Aquila who makes a Greek translation of the Old Testament, but it's a slavish translation of the Hebrew text. And that's exactly what's needed to ground Akiva's teaching into the official standard of the MT for rabbinic Judaism. As Jagot notes,
the Septuagint translation has survived down to the present day under the patronage of the Christian Church. The Greek versions originated in Jewish circles, during the 2nd century of our era, with a view to supplant that translation, have almost entirely disappeared. The first of these versions was the work of Aquila, spoken of by Saint Irenaeus, as a Jewish proselyte of Sinop, in Pontus, and now considered by many as identical with Onkelos, the author of the principal Targum on the Pentateuch. Saint Jerome speaks of him as a disciple of Rabbi Akiva, and there is no doubt that Aquila's translation was made with the same attention to the most minute details of the Hebrew original, as had been inculcated upon his scholars by Rabbi Akiva. As Aquila intended to supply the Greek-speaking Jews with a version which would be an exact counterpart of the Hebrew text, as it had been recently settled, he rendered the original in the most literal way. His work appeared somewhat about 130 to 140, and was very favorably received by the Jews, to whom it proved all the more serviceable in their controversies with the early Christians, because, under its appearance of strict literalism, it seems to have been at times biased in its renderings by dogmatic prejudice.
So here, I think we have some good reasons to believe that what Louis Ginsburg says in the Jewish Encyclopedia, that Akiva wished to disarm Christians of the Septuagint and replace it, I think has merit, because the Aquila translation does essentially that. So for Greek-speaking Jews in Judea and also in the diaspora outside of Judea, the Aquila translation is a replacement translation for the Septuagint. So now he has a Greek translation that his legislation can more or less be discerned even in the Greek text. Now, as before, we noted that there was many Greek-speaking Jews. There were some who knew Hebrew, but there were also a lot of Aramaic-speaking Jews as well. And interesting enough, even here, we find Akiva redefining these scriptures to fit his teaching. As William Yarkin writes,
at Akiva's encouragement, one of his students, Aquila, produced a slavishly literal Greek translation of the Torah that reflected many of the halakhic readings from the Akiva school. Onkelos, who produced the most enduring Aramaic translation, Targum, of the Torah, was similarly influenced by Akiva. The Midrashic works Sifra and Sifra, on Leviticus, characteristically reflect the halakhic views taught by Akiva. In one of halakhic traditions of the pre-Bar Kokhba period, the order he established would eventually be refined by Rabbi Judah Har-Nasi, and known as the Mishnah. William Yarkin, History of Biblical Interpretation. A reader.
So again, we have Akiva being the prime mover between the ascension or the standardization of a single Hebrew text as the basis for rabbinic Judaism, the official Bible of Judaism. You have the Aquila Greek translation, again, a hyper-literal translation that reflects a lot of Akiva's thought. For Greek-speaking Jews, now you have a Targum Onkelos that also in Aramaic reflects the same kind of teachings. As the introduction to the Aramaic Bible says,
the most definitive statement on the subject was made by Professor Goshen Gottstein. According to him, Proto-Onkelos crystallized just before the destruction of Judean cultural centers in Palestine, about the time that the Hebrew text of the Bible had achieved virtual stabilization. The period in question being that stretch of time between the destruction of the temple and Rabbi Akiva's days, 70 to 135 CE. Furthermore, both the Halakhic and Aggadic portions in Targum Onkelos betray the stamp of Rabbi Akiva, as will be shown below. The Aramaic Bible, the Targum Onkelos to Genesis.
So let's summarize what we've seen so far. First, we have the ascension of Rabbi Akiva, who is a mover and shaker during this bottleneck in Jewish history, where rabbinic Judaism is being formed after the destruction of the first temple. You have him also as the backer of the Bar Kokhba revolt. You also have him proposing inclusion and limitation, this interpretive method, which he could read all sorts of new rulings and legislation into all the strange little particular aspects of the Hebrew text. And from that, you can deduce that there must be a standardized official text in which he's working, because after all, you can't anchor your authority in a multitude of diverse texts. There has to be one official text. And so not only do you see this work in the Hebrew, but you also see the same thing through the work of his disciple in Aquila in his translation, Greek translation, which is a hyperliteral translation, really designed to replace the Septuagint. And also at this time, remember, after the first revolt, all you have is the Pharisees who survive intact and the Christians who survive intact. And what's the text that the Christians are using? They're using the Greek Septuagint to prove that Jesus is the Messiah and Son of God. Therefore, something has to be done with this. And so it's quite possible, just as we saw with Louis Ginsburg, that the desire to disarm Christians of the Septuagint and replace it with something that's Hebrew or much closer to the Hebrew. It's done with Aquila. You also have the Targum Onkelos that comes out in the time of Akiva. Now, there were Targums that existed in the first century. We have examples of fragments of Targums in Qumran, but Onkelos is different. Onkelos has the fingerprints of Akiva on it. So no matter what language you spoke in the second Christian century in Judea as a Jew, whether it's Hebrew, Aramaic, or Greek, Akiva has those replacement texts for you. He has singled out only one Hebrew manuscript. He has a disciple who makes a hyperliteral translation as opposed to the Septuagint. And also you have the Targum Onkelos of the first 5 books of the Bible, known as the Pentateuch. All of this literary activity is tied to one single individual who is Akiva ben Joseph. And I think this gives us, when you put all these pieces together, you have to conclude essentially what Louis Ginsburg concludes, namely that Akiva is definitely the one who defined the canon for rabbinic Judaism, and that one of his main desires was to disarm Christians and to break the dominance of the Septuagint in Jewish minds and have it unified under this one belief system, which is proposed by Akiva. Now, some of this is a bit of oversimplification, but nevertheless, I think the cumulative argument shows that it's really the second Christian century that you have the rabbinic Bible. And I think there's also some ancillary evidence as well in the early church fathers. And we may touch on that either next episode or episodes afterwards. So I hope you enjoyed this video. If you did, please give the thumbs up, subscribe if you haven't. Also, William Albrecht and myself are on Patreon. We appreciate your financial support because it enables us to purchase material in order to produce videos like this. So until next time, I'm Gary Machuda. Take care. Bye-bye.